Good morning, everybody. This is the Mack Road Church of Christ Sunday Acts study. We're starting today at Acts chapter 19 and verse 21 is where we're at. Those of you watching this on YouTube, you notice that all the information to contact us is on the screen. I hope you learned something being here today. Remember that we're on Paul's third missionary journey. Here's his third missionary journey. He started over here from Antioch, and he went back and he reviewed the places that he had gone through on his second missionary journey. So he'd gone through Tarsus and Derbe and Lystra and the city and those places. And then we find him over here at Ephesus, where he's at. He's spending about 3 years here, is where we find him. We're going to notice that we're in Acts 19 and verse 21. So we're going to notice this little part here that says, Paul sends Timothy and Erastus to Macedonia, then follows them. So Paul is going to send Timothy and Erastus over here to Macedonia. When he sends them to Macedonia over this way, he's going to meet them over here, and they're going to come down here and do some work in this area over here. But this is where we're at right now. Paul is here at Ephesus, and he has been there for a little while. He's getting ready to see what happens in relation to the result of the work that he's been doing there and what's been happening. And so as we take a look at that, remember that I'm using eSword here, and so that's what's up. And we have this it says that a riot's going to happen here, and that's exactly what we have. So it says in Acts 19 and verse 20, excuse me, Acts 19 and 20, so the word of the Lord was growing mightily and prevailing. Remember that this was happening because they were burning their books and they were confessing their sins and their magic practices. And no doubt one of the reasons they were doing that is because of what happened to the 7 sons of Sceva when they tried to exorcise an individual, and they probably did that because special miracles were happening by Paul. They were taking handkerchiefs from him, and he was going out and those handkerchiefs were then carried to their various individuals, and they were healed and the spirits were cast out of them. And this happened for 2 years. I think I said 3, but it's actually 2 years that Paul was there. So Paul has been working here for 2 years or close to 2 years. And so we notice that, as always, when you preach the gospel, it will have an effect on something around you. If you preach the gospel and nothing is ever affected, then we're probably not preaching the gospel the way we ought to. If people don't see any difference in what Christians are supposed to do, what the world is doing, then we're not preaching it quite right, because there is a stark contrast between what the scriptures teach and how the world teaches us. Now in Acts 19:21 it says, now after these things were finished, Paul purposed in the spirit to go to Jerusalem after he had passed through Macedonia and Achaia, saying, after I have been there, I must also see Rome. And having sent into Macedonia 2 of those who ministered to him, Timothy and Erastus, he himself stayed in Asia for a while. About that time there occurred no small disturbance concerning the way. For a man named Demetrius, a silversmith, who made silver shrines of Artemis, was bringing no little business to the craftsmen. These he gathered together with the workmen of similar trade and said, Men, you know that our prosperity depends upon this business. You see and hear that not only in Ephesus, but in almost all of Asia, this Paul has persuaded and turned away a considerable number of people, saying that gods made with hands are no gods at all. Not only is there danger that this trade of ours falls into repute, but also that the temple of the great goddess Artemis be regarded as worthless, and that she, whom all of Asia and the world worship, will even be dethroned from her magnificence. When they heard this and were filled with rage, they began crying out, saying, Great is Artemis of the Ephesians. The city was filled with confusion, and they rushed with one accord into the theater, dragging also Gaius and Aristarchus, Paul's traveling companions from Macedonia. And when Paul wanted to go into the assembly, the disciples would not let him. Also, some of the Asiarchs, who were friends of his, sent to him and repeatedly urged him not to venture into the theater. So then some were shouting one thing and some another, for the assembly was in confusion and the majority did not know for what reason they had come together. Some of the crowd concluded it was Alexander, since the Jews had put him forward, and having motioned with his hands, Alexander was intending to make a defense to the assembly. But when they recognized that he was a Jew, a single outcry arose from them all as they shouted for about 2 hours, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians." After quieting the crowd, the town clerk said, "Men of Ephesus, what man is there, after all, who does not know that the city of Ephesus is guardian of the temple of the great Artemis and of the image which fell down from heaven? So since these are undeniable facts, you ought to keep calm and do nothing rash. For you have brought these men here who are neither robbers of temples nor blasphemers of our goddess. So then, if Demetrius and the craftsmen who are with him have a complaint against any man, the courts are in session and the proconsuls are available. Let them bring charges against one another. But if you want anything beyond this, it shall be settled in the lawful assembly. For indeed, we are in danger of being accused of a riot in connection with today's events, since there is no real cause for it. And in this connection, we will be unable to account for this disorderly gathering." And after saying this, he dismissed the assembly. So as a result of Paul being there for 2 years, and as a result of the work that him and the disciples were doing there, it started affecting the economy of some of the people there. Verse 21 again says, "Now after these things were finished, Paul purposed in spirit to go to Jerusalem after he had passed through Macedonia and Achaia, saying, after I have been there, I must also see Rome." So I want you to notice that Paul had some long-range goals. He wanted, and notice that it says Paul purposed in the spirit to go to Jerusalem. Now, I'm not sure if by this, when it says purpose in the spirit, you notice that it's capitalized here. I'm not sure whether that's the Holy Spirit or whether that's actually just the Apostle Paul's spirit that he decided or he wants to go to Jerusalem. It kind of sounds like it could just be simply his desire to go up to Jerusalem after he had passed through Macedonia and Achaia. But either way, Paul purposed to go to Jerusalem. Now, after he gets to Jerusalem, his longer range goals were to go see Rome. And so I don't know if the Holy Spirit told him that if you go to Jerusalem, I'll make sure you get to Rome, because that's what we see happening in the next few chapters of the book of Acts, is Paul being arrested in Jerusalem and then eventually going to Rome and eventually being able to preach and meet the brethren that are in Rome. So I don't know whether Paul had been influenced or had been inspired by the Holy Spirit to say that he's going to Jerusalem and then he wants to see Rome, or whether that was Paul's own plans and his own spirit in an effort to go and see Rome, because he wants to go see Rome, because they're a Gentile church and his work is among the Gentile people mainly, even though he preaches to the Jews first. So Paul purposed in the spirit to go to Jerusalem after he had passed through Macedonia and Achaia. So he wanted to go through Macedonia and Achaia, and if you remember, that's this section here. Here's Macedonia and here's Achaia. So he's over here when he says that in Ephesus. And so his plans are to go over here into Macedonia, no doubt visiting Philippi, Thessalonica, maybe Berea, those places where he established churches, and come down here to Corinth, no doubt, in order to be able to speak to them, while he then goes over here really to Jerusalem, where he wants to go, and then goes up to Rome. And so that's Paul's plans. That's what he wants to do. In the meantime, he sends Timothy and Erastus. Verse 22 says, "And having sent into Macedonia 2 of those who ministered to him, Timothy and Erastus, he himself stayed in Asia." And so we notice that Paul had some traveling companions. We know who Timothy is. This Erastus, we're not real sure who he is. We have a couple of references to him. In Romans chapter 16 and verse 23, it says, "Gaius, host to me and to the whole church, greets you. Erastus, the city treasurer, greets you, and Quartus, the brother." Now, the reason I'm reading this is because Paul wrote this letter from Ephesus over here, and Erastus is with him, and Timothy is with him. And notice that he says Erastus was a city treasurer. And one of the things that we can be assured of is that this Erastus really was an individual who, as it says here, was the treasurer, the city treasurer. And so he is an individual who history verifies for us through various artifacts that he actually was the city treasurer. And so he greets them. But he sends Timothy and Erastus over to, sends them over to Macedonia. In 2 Timothy chapter 4 and verse 20, later on, after Paul gets out of his first Roman imprisonment and is imprisoned again, it says in verse 20, Erastus remained at Corinth, but Trophimus I have left sick at Miletus. And so so Erastus was somebody who spent a great deal of time with Paul after he was converted or became a Christian. And so he was with them, and Paul notices him. It says he himself stayed in Asia for a while. So Paul remains in Asia. In other words, he remains there in Ephesus, preaching. Now, while he's doing that, in verse 23, it says, about that time there occurred no small disturbance concerning the way. And notice that Paul calls it the way. There's really no one designation that the Bible has to describe God's people. Sometimes they're called the way. Sometimes they're called the Church of Christ. Sometimes they're called the Church of God. Sometimes they're called the Church of the Firstborn. They are simply, every single one of those is simply a manner of describing the fact that those people are connected with God in one way or another. And so sometimes people have the idea that unless the church they attend has the word Church of Christ on the front of their sign, that church can't be one of God's people. But that's just one of the names that you find. The other thing is you don't find church buildings. There's no place in the scripture where it says that they had a name posted on a sign in front of some building that says that the church meets here or Christians meet here or anything like that, because we don't have any record of them ever owning a building. We do have records of them sharing buildings, like we noticed up here in Ephesus, where he was kicked out of the synagogue and went and preached in the school of Tyrannus. But we have no record of any signs or anything that's up there. And so some people get really upset if you don't have that. But it was called the way here, and what's under consideration. Now, when it says the way, I've talked to you about that before. It means the way of righteousness. And the way of righteousness is by being right with God and according to what the scriptures teach, of course. Now, so there was no small disturbance concerning the way. So why was there a disturbance? Was Paul teaching them to revolt against the Romans? Was he teaching them to do immoral things? Why was it that a disturbance arose? Verse 24 says, for a man named Demetrius, a silversmith, who made silver shrines of Artemis, was bringing no little business to the craftsmen. These he gathered together with the workmen of similar trade and said, men, you see that our prosperity depends upon this business. All right, so now we have the problem. The problem isn't some doctrinal problem. The problem is that the preaching of the gospel is affecting this businessman's bottom line. His bottom line is that he sells trinkets. He sells souvenirs, and he sells souvenirs of the shrine of Artemis. And so it's kind of like when you go to Disneyland and get a little statue of Mickey Mouse or Donald Duck or even the castle that's there, and you take it home to put on your shelf. And no doubt that's a big business for Disneyland. They make a lot of money. Well, that's what's going on here with Demetrius, a silversmith who made silver shrines of Artemis. So these shrines that he made were of silver, so you know they're very expensive. So he was making quite a bit of money, no doubt. But then Paul comes along, and as a result of Paul's preaching, people stop purchasing. Their bottom line has gone down, and they're not selling as many as they used to. And so, like any good businessman, Artemis looks around and tries to figure out, what's going on. Do we need to market it different? And what they find out, it's the teaching of Paul, and that's true. That it's the teaching of Paul, the teaching of the gospel, that is going to bring down this trade, which is a trade of idolatry. Remember, that's what it is. It's a trade of idolatry, because they are making silver shrines of Artemis. I remember once when I was showing a house to an individual. He told me that he's looking at this house because it has a front room. And in that room, he was going to put his God in that front room so he could have a place of going and worshiping him, because he had this statue of the God that he worshiped. And that's what you have going on here in this particular section as well. So they were making lots of money. And so as a result of that, Demetrius gathers the silversmith or the metal workers, and no doubt there's a guild for them, or what you and I might call a union, you might say, where they all get together and they share their knowledge and do those kinds of things together. Verse 25 says, these he gathered together with the workmen of similar trades. So there you go. So not only would it be the silversmith, it'd be the coppersmith, the metal forgers, the iron workers. It would be all the people that deal in, no doubt, metals of some kind, and make certain things and certain commodities to sell. And he says, men, you know that our prosperity depends upon this business. In other words, Demetrius is saying that if they can't make these shrines, or nobody's buying these shrines of Artemis, well, they're going to go out of business. By the way, if you have the King James Version, Artemis probably says the word Diana, and Diana and Artemis are the same individual. And she had, at that time, her temple there in Ephesus, and it was one of the seven wonders of the world at that time. And you can read up on it and look at how marvelous it was. And as far as engineering and as far as architecture, it was a wonder of the world. And inside of it, they had a box, or I guess you could say a box. But they had a place where they had this stone that supposedly was thrown down by the gods that represented Artemis or Diana. And so they would make these shrines. And so he gets together all the workers of similar trade. Now remember that they're similar trade. Now, they're not the same, but they do kind of the same work. And he says, men, you know that our prosperity depends upon this business. Anything that's immoral, anything that's based on the lust of the flesh, or anything that's based on immorality, when the gospel is preached in an area, is going to suffer loss. If the people really believe in God and come to God, especially idolatry. You can't have idolatry and you can't have Jesus in the same hand. They don't work together. Jesus is against idolatry, and idolatry is against Jesus. And so, therefore, you have this problem that goes on. Now, notice that there was no problem or no difficulty while Paul was there for 2 years. We don't know exactly how long it was when this happened, but probably toward the end of his time there, because he had already purposed to go to Jerusalem. So it's probably the end of his time there. But notice that for the first 2 years or almost, that nobody had problems with him. So the preaching of the gospel wasn't something that would cause great difficulty for people who didn't want to believe it. They just wouldn't believe it. But when it comes to immoral activities, like, for example, those magic arts and those magic books that they had turned over to Paul, no doubt the magic book business went down, and now you see the idolatrous silver shrine business go down. And so it affects the immoral activity of the world. And so that's what you need to understand. They're not opposed to the gospel because the gospel is teaching immoral or unkind things, because Christians, in fact, are the most law-abiding and most caring people that anybody could have as their citizens. Now, verse 25, these he gathered together with the workmen of similar trade, men, you know that our prosperity depends upon this business. You see and hear that not only in Ephesus, but in almost all of Asia, this Paul has persuaded and turned away a considerable number of people, saying that gods made with hands are no gods at all. And certainly we understand that. But basically what Paul is saying is your work that you're doing is worthless, because the idols that you're making, the shrines that you're making that people take home and worship, aren't really gods. And so therefore you're cheating the people, you're deceiving the people. And so as Paul taught that message and taught about the one true God, people stopped buying those relics and stopped buying those shrines and those souvenirs. And so therefore so therefore they were losing considerable business as a result of it, because Paul was persuading that gods made with hands are no gods at all. In Cuba, there is a famous Catholic shrine or church building that is supposed to be a place where the Virgin Mary appeared to them. And so that they built this basically a Catholic church building with her in the center there, along with Jesus. And going up to this building, you have to pass these little roads. And in these little roads, they have all kinds of individuals that are there in little booths selling shrines of the Virgin Mary and selling dolls of the Virgin Mary, so you can take them home. And I remember passing through there, and as we're going through, they could tell that we were visitors. And so they all run to the car trying to sell us something. And when we said no, one of them actually got mad that we weren't going to buy anything. And so that's what you have going on over here with the Diana and those people who make it. So verse 26 says, you see and hear that not only in Ephesus, but in almost all of Asia, this Paul has persuaded and turned away a considerable number of people, saying that gods made with hands are no gods at all. And certainly that's true. And so he's pointing out that that's the teaching of Paul. The teaching of Paul is that there are no idols. And so therefore everybody engaged in that idolatrous practice is going to come in conflict with the teaching of the gospel. But notice that the teaching of the gospel, they didn't go out and destroy their temple. They didn't go out and destroy their men who were making shrines. They didn't go out and kill people or revolt. That's not the way the gospel works. The gospel works by persuading and turning away people to the truth and from wickedness and from deception and lies. And as you turn people away from deception and lies and they accept the truth, it's going to change their activity, and therefore the world is going to become a better place. And that's what some people don't understand about being a Christian. Some people, especially in our country, seem to think that the problem with our world is that there's Christians around, because the Christians actually stand for something. And what they don't understand is the Christians are the reason why our country is around and will continue to be around as long as God is reaping people from it. But we're noticing a decline in the attitude towards Christians as opposed to how it used to be. In Acts 19, verse 27, he then says, not only is there danger that this trade of ours falls into disrepute, which is really what he's concerned about. He's concerned about his money. And he says, but also that the temple of the great goddess Artemis be regarded as worthless, and that whom all of Asia and the world worships will even be dethroned from her magnificence. Well, Demetrius wasn't a prophet, but he certainly did predict what was going to happen as the Christian movement was embraced by the people of that area. And that is that the temple of Artemis fell into disrepute. And today, basically, you can look on the internet, and you can look for the ruins of the temple of Artemis, and that's what you find. You find just a few ruins that are left. She's been dethroned from her magnificence. But at the time that Paul was writing, they considered her one of the gods. And so, therefore, they Uh, therefore, Demetrius was correct in that thinking, and so he wanted to try to put a stop to it before it got worse. And so, verse 28 says, when they heard this, when they heard this and were filled with rage, they began crying out, saying, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians." Now, I want you to notice that they didn't say, "Great is Demetrius and the silversmiths who sell shrines and do that." No, what they began to say is, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians," because as long as you can make Artemis or Diana great, then people are going to buy her shrines. But when she's no longer great, people aren't going to buy them anymore. It's kind of like collectibles. Sometimes collectibles are very expensive, and then in a couple of years they fall into disrepute, and you can't even sell them on the market if you wanted to. But that's what's going on here. And so the people heard this, and they certainly didn't want this to happen, because no doubt the temple of Artemis brought in great wealth for the community of Ephesus. It's kind of like when you have a basketball team in your city, that they're gonna create a lot of income by side businesses and even their own playing, and that's what's going to happen here. People would come from all over the world to see the seventh wonder of the world and to worship the goddess Diana, and so there was all this ancillary business that was being made and money that was being made. But if they don't think Artemis is really a god, then nobody's going to come. So they began to yell, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians." Now, verse 29. The city was filled with confusion, and they rushed with one accord into the theater, dragging along Gaius and Aristarchus, Paul's traveling companions from Macedonia. Now, I want you to notice it says the city was filled with confusion, and they rushed with one accord into the theater. So what's going on is that as this crowd is getting bigger and bigger and the commotion is getting louder and louder, everybody starts joining in, and nobody really knows why they're there. Nobody really understands what's going on or what's happening. And so as they're going into the arena, they find a couple of Paul's traveling companions because they can't find Paul. And so they drag Gaius and Aristarchus with them, who were Paul's traveling companions from Macedonia. And verse 30 says, and when Paul wanted to go into the assembly, the disciples would not let him. So Paul wanted to go out there in order to be able to speak to them. Now, just a little side note here. If you look at the Greek word here, let me just do this here for you real quick. If you look at this Greek word for the Greek word assembly here, you find out, not this one, but the next one a little further down, you find out that the word means, no, I can't find what I'm looking for. I'll find it in just a minute, sorry. But the word assembly or the word gathering that's used in here, one of them is the word church, which just simply means a gathering of people. Now, in Acts 19:30 says, and when Paul wanted to go into the assembly, the disciples would not let him. Verse 31, also some of the Asiarchs who were friends of his, sent to him and repeatedly urged him not to venture into the theater. So Paul wanted to go in there. He wanted to be able to give his defense or give a defense. And no doubt he's thinking, here's an opportunity to preach the gospel. There's all these people that are there. And so he's willing to go in. But the people who knew the crowd and knew how they would react said, Paul, no, don't go do that. And so the Asiarchs, who were the provincial rulers of that area, they also encouraged Paul not to go in and just to lay low for a while until things blew over. And so sometimes it's good for us to listen to other people when it comes to decisions that we're going to make. So we get back to the crowd here in verse 32. So as we get back to the crowd, you notice in verse 32 it says, so then some were shouting one thing and some another, for the assembly was in confusion, and the majority did not know for what reason they had come together. And so what you have here is when he says, so then, some were shouting one thing and some another. They didn't understand why they were out there. The people who first started it, they understood. But as the crowd got bigger and bigger, they weren't sure why they were out there. The only thing they knew is that they're talking about Diana or Artemis. And so they all go out there to see what's going on. And whenever you have a big crowd, it's easy to be caught up in the things that the crowd is doing. And so it says, for the assembly was in confusion, and the majority did not know for what reason they had come out. So they didn't understand why they came out, and they were all in confusion. So they're all there. There's a crowd. Some were crying, great is Diana, is Artemis of the Ephesians, and other people were coming and joining, but they weren't sure why they were there. And so verse 33 says, and some of the crowd concluded it was Alexander, since the Jews had put him forward, and having motioned with his hands, Alexander was intending to make a defense to the assembly. Now verse 34 says, but when they recognized that he was a Jew, a single outcry arose from them all, that they shouted for about 2 hours, great is Artemis of the Ephesians. Now in verse 33, it mentions this guy Alexander, and it says that some of the crowd concluded that it was Alexander. In other words, they're trying to figure out what's going on, and so they see Alexander kind of was put out in front of the group, or was on the stadium, or on the podium, or the stage, or wherever he was, and they saw him, and so they figured it must have been something that he did. Now, why would they think it's something that he did? Well, I'd suggest to you, first of all, because he's a Jew, and being a Jew, even though he wasn't a Christian, being a Jew, he wouldn't go along with, if he was a good Jew, he wouldn't go along with idols, and he wouldn't go along with the making of shrines for Artemis, because Jews believe in one God. They believe in the God of the Old Testament. And so when they see Alexander in front of this crowd, and he's in front, some of them were thinking, well, he did it. It must be because of what he did. Now, I want you to notice that this isn't the only place that we read about Alexander. We find him over here in 1 Timothy chapter 1 and verse 20. And I want you to notice what Paul says about him there. He says, among these are Hymenaeus and Alexander, whom I have handed over to Satan, so that they will be taught not to blaspheme. So there's that name Alexander, who apparently they were supposed to know. And also in verse 14 of 2 Timothy 4, it says, Alexander the coppersmith did me much harm. The Lord will repay him according to his deeds. So this Alexander was probably, in Acts 19:33, the same Alexander that he mentions in Timothy here in those places, because Alexander over here, especially in 2 Timothy 4 and verse 14, was a coppersmith. Remember that Demetrius had gathered all those of the same trade, or of the same guild, you remember, that he had called them. And so that would include the coppersmiths. And so they put out Demetrius came out. Alexander came out, and they had Alexander there for a purpose of trying to settle what was going on there. And so remember, he gathered all those of the same trade. Now it says some of the crowd concluded it was Alexander, since the Jews had put him forward. So the Jewish community put Alexander forward, and he was a coppersmith of the same trade. And so no doubt they thought, well, maybe they'll listen to Alexander. And probably the Jews were going to try to jump on this bandwagon of Paul by claiming that there's only one God. And no doubt they were going to say, it's the God of the Old Testament, which of course is true if you understand Jesus is also the God of the Old Testament. But it says, since the Jews had put him forward, and having motioned with his hand, Alexander was intending to make a defense to the assembly. So he was going to defend the idea of the gods made with hands are really not gods. And so he really wasn't the guy that you should put out there if you're trying to calm this crowd down, because the crowd is upset because there's people teaching that Diana isn't a god. And so it wouldn't help to put Alexander, even though he's a Jew out there, because Alexander believes the same thing. Now, verse 34 says, but when they recognized that he was a Jew, a single outcry arose from them all that as they shouted for about 2 hours, great is Artemis of the Ephesians. So there you have it. When they recognized that he was a Jew, and they understood that the Jews also are against a plurality of gods, then rather than give him an opportunity to speak, they just began to shout out, great is Artemis of the Ephesians. They did it for 2 hours. So there was a riot going on. You and I might call it a protest, because that seems to be the way our protests have been going in our country lately. They turn into riots, not by everybody, but by those who start them. And so in Acts 19, verse 35, it says, after quieting the crowd, now this is after 2 hours of shouting, great is Artemis of the Ephesians. Can you imagine shouting the same thing for 2 hours, great is Artemis of the Ephesians? And then verse 35 says, and after quieting the crowd, the town clerk said, men of Ephesus, what man is there after all who does not know that the city of the Ephesians is guardian of the temple of the great Artemis and of the image which fell down from heaven? So as the town clerk is trying to take control of this mob and this revolt that's going on, he speaks to the men of Ephesus and says, what man is there after all who does not know that the city of Ephesus is guardian to the temple? In other words, he's saying everybody knows that the main reason for the city of Ephesus is to guard the temple of the great Artemis. So basically what he's saying is this movement is not going to destroy us, or is not going to change the city. But in reality, it did. That's what's really interesting. And it did it quietly and silently, because that's the way the gospel works. It works from inside, not open rebellions, not open fights, not people threatening one another. And so it says the town clerk was trying to quiet them down. And so he says, of the image which fell down from heaven. In other words, that was the legend. The legend was that this stone that was inside the temple, that was held by the temple, was a stone that fell from heaven and represented, or was, the image of Artemis. And so we don't know exactly how that stone looked. We don't have any drawings or pictures of it. So we're not exactly sure. Now, we know how images that were carved by people look about Artemis, but we're not sure exactly how the actual stone that fell from heaven looked. Some people suggest that it could have been just a meteor, and maybe it was shaped like a woman. And so that's where the legend started from, or that's who was in the box. But it did fall from heaven, and that's what they have recorded here. Now, what I think is interesting is, if you're going to worship a God, why are you going to worship a God that fell from heaven? Now you might say, well, what about Jesus? Well, Jesus didn't fall from heaven. Jesus descended from heaven. Jesus came down from heaven, and then he ascended back up into heaven. He didn't fall down, but this woman fell down to the earth. And so why in the world would you want to worship an image that falls down to the earth? Now, verse 36 says, so since these are undeniable facts, you ought to keep calm and do nothing rash. Now, it's interesting that he says, since these are undeniable facts. What's interesting is that many people say that things are undeniable facts, when in reality, they're not. And as a result of that, it creates all kinds of problems, because they're not dealing with the truth. The truth is that these are deniable facts. The fact that she's a god is a deniable fact. The fact that the image fell from heaven and from Zeus is deniable. And the fact that she actually has power is deniable. So it's interesting that those individuals who want to prove their point, they'll talk about undeniable facts, when in reality they aren't undeniable facts. It's kind of like what's going on today with COVID. You have some doctors who are telling you these are the facts, and you have other doctors who are saying those aren't the facts, and the doctor who are saying these are the facts say those other doctors don't listen to them because they don't have the facts. And so it's a question of whose facts do you want, rather than trying to actually find the truth and understand what's going on. Groups pick their own undeniable facts, you might say. Now, there are facts about what's going on, but who has them is sometimes hard to determine. And so he says to the group, you ought to keep quiet, calm, and do nothing rash. The reason he says that is because if they create a riot or they create problems, then Rome and the Roman legions are going to come in and they're going to quiet down the revolt or the riot. And they generally do that by coming in and removing the rulers that are there and placing other people as rulers who can keep the peace. And so verse 37 says, for you have brought these men here who are neither robbers of temples nor blasphemers of our God. Now, I want you to notice that what the town clerk says is, apparently he knows who these individuals are because it's his job to know what's going on in the town. And so he says that you brought these people here. They've never robbed our temple. They don't go and throw eggs at the temple of Diana. They don't send people over to blow it up. That's not the way the gospel movement works. That's not the way God conquers individuals. That's the way the world conquers individuals. The world does it by force, and that's what you're seeing with the protests that are going on in America today. That individuals are trying to get their point by force and by destroying property and by harming other individuals, and some individuals who are more fearful of the people that are creating these problems than they are about what's right, kowtow to them. And so that's what you have going on here. But the person from the town clerk says that Paul and his people, they're not robbers of temples, and they're not blasphemers of our God. Well, I would suggest by that what he means is that they don't stand up on the street corners and run around telling people Diana is not a god, and therefore their whole preaching or their whole message is that Diana is not a god. That's not the message of the gospel. The message of the gospel is we have a God. The message of the gospel is we're going to follow Jesus. And therefore, when you follow Jesus, then you understand that other gods are not gods. But we don't have to go around blaspheming those gods just because we don't believe them. Now, verse 38 says, so then, if Demetrius and the craftsmen who are with him have a complaint against any man, the courts are in session and proconsuls are available. Let them bring charges against one another. Now, I want you to notice that the town clerk says that, look, we have civil laws, and if the Christians and Paul and his companions have done anything that is against the law, that there are courts, and you are certainly welcome to take them to court and have the proconsuls and the judges determine the charges that you bring against them. So they have a legal recourse if that's what they want to do. But the problem is what are they going to do? They're going to take them to court and say, these men claim that the God we're following is not a God. Well, the problem with that is I'm sure there's many people who believe that Diana is not the God to worship because they had a plurality of gods. And some of them worshiped other gods instead of Diana. And so what are they going to be able to do if they take them to the proconsul? Say, look, they're teaching that Diana is not a god and it's affecting our business. So, but the courts are in session if they've done something criminal. What's under consideration? Now, verse 39. But if you want anything beyond this, it shall be settled in a lawful assembly. And here's the word that I meant when I talked to you about the fact that the word assembly is actually the word that the Bible teaches for church. There it is here, according to Strong's. It's ecclesia, and ecclesia we've translated it as church, and there it is there. And Thayer's also defines it primarily as, and I want you to notice this, a gathering of citizens called out from their homes into some public place, an assembly. So why do I say this? Because some people think the word church is a religious word. and they think that the word church can only be used by religious groups that meet. The word church simply means a called out group of people. Now, we are the called out group of people of God, or we're the called out group of people of Christ, but the word church just means called out. There's no religious significance to it. The religious significance comes in to the modifier that you add after it. For example, the church of God, or the church of Satan, or the church of Diana. The word church just simply means a group of people. That's all that it means. And so there's nothing religious about it. And here it's used a couple of different times in this way. It's used here in Acts 19:39. It's used that way again over here in Acts 19:41. And so the idea is that it's an assembly. This assembly had been called out for the purpose of trying to persuade people to not listen to Paul. But the town clerk uses the word assembly. And so remember that. Remember, if you would, the word church isn't a religious word. Now, it might be in our time today, but it's not the way the Greek word's used. It just simply means a gathering of people. So there's not some baggage that goes along with this assembly. It just simply means a called out group of people. Now, verse 40 says, "For indeed, we are in danger of being accused of a riot in connection with today's events, since there is no real cause for it. And in this connection, we will be unable to account for this disorderly gathering." And that's where that word is used again. Now, the town clerk points out that indeed, we are in danger of being accused of a riot. Now, you don't want to be accused of a riot under Roman rule. The purpose for allowing the rulers to rule their own little areas there, the client kings under the Roman Empire, was to keep down riots and revolts and to keep peace among the people. But if they're going to be a riot, there better be a good reason for a riot, and the town clerk says there isn't. There's no real cause for it. And in this connection, we will be unable to give an account for this disorderly gathering. The account would be given to the Roman rulers and the Roman government, who is in charge of the world, the known world at that time. And so therefore, the town clerk wanted to quiet this group down. And so it says in verse 41, "And after saying this, he dismissed the assembly." So after saying that, the crowd went home. And so chapter 20 then, and verse 1 says, "After the uproar had ceased, Paul sent for the disciples. And when he had exhorted them and taken his leave of them, he left to go to Macedonia. And when he had gone through those districts and had given them much exhortation, he came to Greece. And there he spent 3 months. And when a plot was formed against him by the Jews, as he was about to set sail for Syria, he decided to return through Macedonia. And he was accompanied by Sopater of Berea, the son of Prius, and by Aristarchus and Secundus of the Thessalonians, and Gaius of Derbe, and Timothy and Tychicus, and Trophimus of Asia. But these had gone on ahead and were waiting for us at Troas. We sailed from Philippi after the days of unleavened bread and came to them at Troas within 5 days, and there we stayed 7 days." Now, I want you to notice a couple of things here in this section. I want you to notice that it says, after the uproar had ceased, Paul sent for his disciples, or for the disciples, and when he had exhorted them and taken his leave of them, he left to go to Macedonia. So Paul leaves there to go to Macedonia. And let me put our map up here real quick, and we'll notice that he was here at Ephesus. So right after the riot, he then goes over here into Macedonia. And it says he encourages the churches. So he goes to Philippi, Thessalonica, Berea, probably comes down here to Athens if there was a church there. And then he's going to come over here to Corinth and that area. And so Paul is here. He's getting ready to go up this way into Macedonia is what's going to happen. And so he calls the disciples, he takes leave of them, and he exhorts them, and then he leaves and goes into Macedonia. Now, verse 2, when he had gone through those districts and had given them much exhortation, he came to Greece. So as Paul goes through there, he exhorts them, and he preaches the word to them, and he builds them up. And that's part of what Paul's work was. Paul's work was to establish and help build and teach the churches where he was at. And so that's exactly what he goes to do. And it says in verse 3, and there he spent 3 months. And when a plot was formed against him by the Jews, as he was about to set sail for Syria, he decided to return through Macedonia. And let me put this map up here for just a second. And I want you to notice that Paul goes up here, he comes through here, he comes down here to Achaia, and he comes to Greece, okay? And when he comes down here, it says that he wanted to go back up here and set sail across here, right here, because it's real easy to just set sail right across there and get back to Ephesus and then continue his journey down here as he goes back down, because you notice the boat line there, or the line where he would take boats, because that's the fastest way to travel there. But Paul's going to come over here to Corinth. He stays here for about 3 months in this area. As he stays there, it says this plot arose. And so rather than him coming across, because they were probably waiting for him at the docks, rather than him doing that, he then decided to go back upland and go this way, and then left from Philippi down on his journey back to Jerusalem. So I just want you to notice that. That's what he's talking about here, as he says, and he spent three months there, and when a plot was formed against him by the Jews, as he was about to set sail for Syria, he decided to return through Macedonia. So instead of going across in a boat, he went upland. Now, verse 4, and he was accompanied by Sopater Berea, the son of Pyrrhus, and by Aristarchus and Secundus of Thessalonica. Now, you might be wondering who these individuals are, but if you take a look at 1 Corinthians chapter 16, as Paul is mentioning the contribution for the saints, remember that he's in Corinth, and when he was in Corinth, or when he gets to Corinth, he's going to be collecting some funds, and these funds are for the poor saints that are in Jerusalem. It says in 1 Corinthians 16:1, now concerning the collection for the saints, as I directed the churches of Galatia, so do you also. On the first day of every week, each one of you is to put aside and save, as he may prosper, so no collection be made when I come. And when I arrive, whomever you approve, I will send them with letter to carry your gift to Jerusalem. And if it is fitting for me to go also, they will go with me. So as Paul is traveling through these areas, he's collecting funds for the church, for the churches in Jerusalem who are going to be having problems because of a famine. And so every town he goes to, or every place he goes to, he has them give a collection. Now, notice that it said in 1 Corinthians 16 that whomever you appoint, you may put in charge of it, and he'll write a letter to send them to Jerusalem, or they can accompany Paul as he's going to Jerusalem. And so that's who these men are. These men are the different people. See, there's one from Thessalonica, there's one from Derbe, and there's one from Asia, who are with Paul. And they're not just traveling companions, but they're taking along the contribution from those churches to the church in Jerusalem. And so one of the things that this shows us is that churches are responsible for distributing their own funds and for taking their own funds to wherever they need to go. Now, notice that they didn't give them to Paul, and Paul put them in his pocket and he took them, but they each sent their own man to go. Today we do that by using a service called the post office, and we'll send it. but we don't send it to some other group first and then have them send the money. The scriptures teach that each church is responsible for how they distribute their funds and their money. And here's an example of these men who are accompanying Paul, no doubt bringing the contribution from the churches that they represent down to Jerusalem in order to help the brethren down there. Then verse 5 says, but these had gone ahead and were waiting for us at Troas. So those individuals had probably already gone ahead and were over here at Troas, which is right here. So they probably set sail across and were there, whereas Paul went up here by land, and he comes over here to Troas is where he comes. And so that's probably what's under consideration when this plot arose. So they didn't want to get the people that were with Paul, they wanted to get Paul. So the men who were with Paul, they probably just sailed across, which is the fastest way, and they were waiting for Paul there. And Paul then traveled back to Macedonia by land, and then took a boat across to Troas so that those people who were after him wouldn't find him. And so it says in verse 5, but these had gone on ahead and were waiting for us at Troas. Verse 6 says, we sailed from Philippi after the days of unleavened bread and came to them at Troas within 5 days, and there we stayed 7 days. And so Paul sails from Philippi after the days of unleavened bread. And so after the days of unleavened bread would be those 7 days that they were supposed to do after the Passover, when they removed all leaven from their house, the Jews were. And so after that, after the days of unleavened bread, then they came to Troas within 5 days. And so they're there in Troas in 5 days. And there we stayed 7 days. And so that's where we're going to stop today. We'll start with Acts 20 and verse 7 next week. Hope all of you learned something. I was a little, what's a good word for it? I was a little unorganized today, you might say. Sorry about that. I hope you get to meet with us the next time that we meet, and pray God blesses you and keeps you.